Okay, I've got to turn to Jonah today. I love Jonah because the book is just one big joke. So I think about jokes. And actually about 10 years ago, in 2005, the New York Times reported the death of the joke in 2005. Under the headline, "Seriously, the joke is dead," the Times explained it this way. In case you missed its obituary, the joke died recently after a long illness of 30 years. Its passing was barely noticed, drowned out by the din of ironic one-liners and snark that pass for humor these days. Also, as America's greatest humorist once said of himself, reports of such a demise are exaggerated. The joke is as timeless as Jonah. The book of Jonah finds out what kind of readers we are, whether we are literalists or whether we are lovers of a tall tale. In Jonah, literalists lose a lot. They might justify this wildly funny, improbable, subversive story as history, and that's fine, because even looking at Jonah that way, you can still get the point of the story. But if you look at it in a literal, historical way, you're going to miss a lot of its pleasures. The book of Jonah is structured like a joke in Hebrew in which it was originally written. It starts with this outrageous premise, Jonah's impossible assignment, and his outlandish response. He runs in the opposite direction, as if anyone can hide from God. Any of you that have tried, you know what I'm talking about. A disaster at sea is played for laughs. Jonah has such an unintentionally saving effect that even the hardened sailors repent because of him. But Jonah himself may not be saved. Hoping to rescue their ship, the sailors lighten their load of every last bit of cargo, and they finally throw Jonah overboard. And just when things could hardly get any worse, Jonah winds up in the belly of a large fish. So Jonah prays. He prays to the very God that he ran away from, and he prays that this very God will now hear him calling from the depths of the sea. And as prayers go, it's not terribly sincere. Jonah alternates between pleading and blaming God for the situation. And God answers the prayer by having the fish vomit Jonah up on the land. Now, this Jew who thought he was too good for Nineveh, according to Jewish law, is unclean because he's been spewed out by a fish. All this sets up the laughs for our reading today. The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. You can hear the mirth of ancient Hebrew audiences as God tells Jonah almost word for word exactly what God told him the first time. Get up, go to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim to it the message I will tell you. Professional comedians call this effect a callback. Nineveh, we should note, holds no appeal for Jonah. It is fantastically vile. They are so corrupt, they have done such hideous, heinous crimes against human beings. Kind of, you could compare them to modern-day ISIS. I mean, this is how vile Nineveh was. And in this story, it's preposterously huge. It's a 3 days walk, or it's about 60 miles across. So clearly, this task is impossible for one reluctant man. And he hardly says anything. All he says, and you could translate this in modern language, 40 days more and Nineveh is toast. There's not a word of hope in all of his preaching. He holds out no promise. If anything, he announces an anti-gospel. Jonah, in fact, in Hebrew, his name is Noah backwards. Jonah seems to expect something like the flood when the people did not repent and God wiped them out in 40 days. But amazingly, Nineveh repents. 40 days, you're toast. They repent. And even the pagan king calls for fasting and sackcloth and ashes. And the only one who suffers a flood is Jonah, who has spent time in the belly of a fish and been vomited out on dry land. Apparently, God's purposes can be accomplished with a minimum of faithfulness. And such faithfulness turns out to be a matter of not merely what one feels, but what one does. And now, confronted with his astounding success he by no means wanted to have, Jonah stomps off to sulk. I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful and slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, he cries, repeating, of course, the Hebrew creed for what they believe about God. And melodramatically, he asks God to put him out of his misery. And this is a distinctively Jewish form of complaint. The kill me now joke is one of the great foundations of Jewish humor. Like the mother who sticks her head in the oven when her son drops out of medical school, or marries a Christian girl. Or even if you look at the entire works of Woody Allen. Comics speak of the rule of three, which means that a joke gets its greatest laughs when the situation comes around the third time. But now when God addresses Jonah for the third time, the laughs are deeper, not greater, as we begin to see that Jonah embodies our own grudges, our own prejudices, our own judgments against people. Originally, the pointed message was that Israel, which had once seen itself as a light to the nations, had grown ever more defensive after years of military losses and diplomatic concessions to foreign powers. Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, represented the enemy camp at its most powerful and its most wicked. No Jew, no self-respecting, good, patriotic Jew would have ever wanted to lift a finger to help the Ninevites. And likewise, there's nothing in the historical record that suggests that the Assyrian king and his people turned to the Hebrew God. Yes, they acknowledged that this God was going to destroy them, but then did they turn and then worship that God? No, there's no evidence of that. The point of the message remains. If God really intends salvation for all people, then in all seriousness, we at least need to talk to our enemies. It's a timeless message that could be drawn from today's headlines. Like I said, put ISIS in the place here. I'm not going to go preach to ISIS because I know if they repent, God is forgiving, abounding in steadfast love. Don't want to do it. Who is beyond the pale of God's forgiveness, do we think? ISIS, who's as heinous in their crimes as Nineveh? Or let's take it a step further. Let's take it a step further and look at who are we prejudiced against, and whether what we define as sin is really sin. We used to look at people of other colors as being less important or not even human to people of pale skin. Today we continue to treat our brothers and sisters in the LGBTQ community. By the way, that's lesbian, gay, transgendered, bisexual, and queer. Queer no longer is a dirty word in that community. It has been reclaimed. Do we continue to treat them as unforgivable sinners rather than as people who are different than we are simply because of who they choose to love? Who is it? Who is it that is our pet person who is beyond the pale of God's love? That is who Jonah's story is convicting us of. Other examples may come to you, but none, of course, are more current than Jonah. This is not just a tall tale about ancient feuds. No, the joke, if it is a joke, is on us. The joke is on our quarrel with the compassionate nature of God, who loves all people. And God's divine compassion is the last word, the very last word of the book of Jonah. And it's always the last word in the story of all of our lives. Thanks be to God.